I'd like to bring up Sophia Cofinas to introduce, and she's going to handle the Q&A. So coming up, Sophia. Sophia is a third-year student who's majoring in public policy and international studies. So Sophia, you're going to take the show from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Thompson for that introduction, and I am happy to be making an introduction of my own. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this afternoon, Jessyn Farrell. Jessyn, a longtime environmental advocate, is the director of the Office of Sustainability and Environment for the City of Seattle. We are so excited to have her here and to have the ability to hear about all of the incredible work that she has done for the City of Seattle. Her work has included groundbreaking safety legislation, affordable housing projects, education support, and so much more. She's focusing on issues involving the environment, housing, transportation, and the economy. And the work that Jessyn does for the city really aligns directly with Seattle University's mission and values, with her work paving the way for a more innovative, sustainable, and progressive world. Please join me in welcoming Jessyn Farrell to the stage.
Good afternoon. It is so delightful to be here. Thank you so much to the Seattle University community for hosting me today. I am Jessyn Farrell, as you just learned, and I am actually a graduate of Boston College Law School. So I love the Jesuit education, and that has definitely impacted a lot of my career decisions and the work that I've done over these last 20 years. So I am going to talk a little bit about a good news story to celebrate Earth Day, a big piece of legislation that the city of Seattle just recently enacted. And I'm going to talk about what the legislation is, and then I'm going to pull the curtain back and talk about how we actually made that happen. But before I do that, the Office of Sustainability and Environment is working together with the Bloomberg Green Fest to bring the first ever Green Fest to Seattle. And so I get a moment to just plug, make sure you take advantage of this great opportunity to get a free admission. Hold the date, July 10th through 13th, and sign up. So that's your PSA. I just did that. And now I will jump into my presentation. So I'm going to use the space bar here. I think that's my preferred method. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Seattle's Building Emissions Performance Standard, and we're going to spend a few minutes really diving into the policy, and then I'm going to talk about how we did this thing. So, okay, so first, a little bit about the context. Why are we talking about building emissions today? Of course, this is, now an unfortunately iconic picture of the Space Needle shrouded in wildfire smoke. And we are not only feeling the effects of the climate crisis firsthand now, but we're also needing to work to, build climate resiliency, decarbonize everything as fast as we can, and do it at the pace, of government and community and industry and so many more competing interests. So part of the thing that we need to do, of course, is to decarbonize our buildings, and that is in part because in Seattle's emissions profile, buildings are a really big chunk, 37% of the city's emissions. We'll talk about transportation next year. And so building emissions in Seattle, while we have an electric grid that is publicly owned, Seattle City Light, we're really lucky to have that. There are a lot of different ways that we use fossil gas in our buildings, whether it's gas stoves. We talked a little bit about that today, gas-powered boilers, furnaces. There are a lot of different ways that we use fossil fuel in our buildings, and so we need to decarbonize all of that. And our building emission performance standard is all about that. So this is one of those charts that is really daunting. We see that to be able to actually get to net zero by 2050, we are going to have to rapidly scale down our emissions from buildings. So we've seen charts like this for a long time. What I will say is this policy that we just passed is going to reduce our building emissions by 27%. So it actually takes a big bite out of our building emissions and overall city emissions by 10%. So in one single policy move, we're taking 10% out of our city's emissions. So we only need to do that 9 more times and we'll be there. Okay, so first a little bit of background. The city has been engaged in helping building owners take action to make their buildings more efficient for a really long time. And we have a foundation of understanding the emissions profile of all 4,000 of our largest buildings in the city. So because we've been doing something called energy benchmarking and reporting since 2011, we've been working with building owners to do energy tune-up since 2019. We're in this position where we can now take this big step to actually decarbonize our buildings. So while we did a lot of work in the last 2 years to actually create the legislation and pass it, it's really layered over several years of work to get ready to do this. And of course, we are not the only city, we are not the only state that is addressing this. We have lots of peer cities that are trying to address building emissions. And this was a really actually important piece as we were negotiating this standard with building owners, to be able to say we are not alone. There are a lot of other cities, peer cities like Boston, that have a similar building profile in some ways to Seattle. So this is a really important part of our story, which is that a lot of cities around the country are trying to do this right now. Okay, so here's a picture of the endpoint where all of the advocates and the mayor were signing the legislation into legislation, and it's really exciting. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about towards the end of the presentation, but I'll give a little preview, is the importance of political leadership. This absolutely would not have gotten done without a mayor who wanted to do it and without a city council who wanted to do it. So political leadership really matters, even in highly polarized times like these. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what a building emissions performance standard is. I mentioned a couple things about the great things that this is going to do for us. It will reduce our emissions by 27% over our 2008 baseline. And that's basically the equivalent of taking almost 72,000 gas-powered cars off the road every year. So this is a really significant step forward, and we're really excited about it. This was a very complicated policy to pass. Obviously, we were weighing very heavily the crisis and the need to move so quickly. We were also balancing environmental justice, which has a really different timeline, working with community and building trust and showing up and doing what we say we would do and coming back and listening and iterating often is a really different timeline than what it's going to take to get to net zero. And so really navigating that kind of inherent difference in timeline. Downtown revitalization. Post-COVID, we have a downtown that is still really struggling. This regulation asks those downtown building owners to make big investments in their buildings. So how did we do this in a way that really took into account the really challenging and economic impacts of COVID? Equipment life cycles and market signals. It was really important to do this now because it's a program that will take really 2.5 decades to achieve the endpoint. Another issue that we really wrestled with was how do we do workforce transition? We talk about a just transition a lot of the time, but in reality, environmental regulations and workforce improvements haven't always gone together. I think of, kind of that iconic example around the spotted owl and regulating endangered species and what that meant for the workforce that was cutting timber. We haven't gotten it right in the past. And so we were really challenged as we were creating this regulation. How are we going to manage gas workers who are not going to have access to those electric jobs that this policy is going to make? Affordable housing. There's a rent crisis. There's a housing crisis in this city. This is an added cost. How are we building that into our policy to make sure that it doesn't impact renters and low-income building owners? And then, of course, our city-owned building portfolio, we have to decarbonize ourselves as well, and how are we leading by example? So threading the needle, threading the space needle, you can see this was really complex with a lot of things that we had to balance. Okay, but the good news is that we did thread some of those needles, and in putting together this legislation, we really kind of centered the multiple benefits that it will bring. So not just the decarbonization side, but also the well-paying clean energy jobs. And to really foster that transition, the city needs to, put its money where its mouth is and really invest in that workforce transition. And so my department, Office of Sustainability and Environment, is investing $1 million in building access and career pathways for women and BIPOC members of our community to get access to all of the different jobs, not just the electricity, but the engineering, the design, the whole gamut of workforce changes that's going to happen as a result of this policy. And then finally, just to say as a little more context before we jump into really the nitty-gritty of the policy, we did a lot of outreach. We did 2 years of engagement. We talked to hundreds of community members. We had technical advisory committees. We worked with our Green New Deal Oversight Board, which represents frontline communities, so that we had a really strong community voice as we were making this policy. We talked to affordable housing, nonprofit developers, our labor and trade partners, and so many more people. But really that deep engaged listening was a key part of how we were able to get this over the finish line and design a policy that at the end of the day is actually really implementable. We want building owners to be successful in doing this. Okay, so what is this? It covers 4,000 of our biggest buildings across the city. A lot of them are downtown. Some of them are on this campus. And it's asking these building owners to invest in decarbonizing by 2050. And so to get there, we are asking building owners to verify the previous year's energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. They need to report emissions performance and create a plan so that we can work with them to actually achieve the net zero. They have to meet their greenhouse gas intensity targets. We have 3 pathways. I'll talk a little bit about that, with the endpoint getting to net zero in 2050. And so every building is different. And the challenge that we faced is, how do we create a regulation that is kind of common and predictable, and at the same time takes into account the different needs that different building owners or different, like a university campus like Seattle University may have over a downtown office building. So we created 3 different pathways that have different ways of complying. And as this legislation gets ramped up, a building owner or a campus will be able to select one of these pathways and work with us to actually decarbonize and make the plan to do it. One of the things we heard from community members was that we need to provide coaching, technical support, capital investment. These are going to be really expensive, in some cases, investments, and that we need to walk with building owners through this to be able to make sure that they're able to reach these emissions targets. And so this is kind of a busy slide. I won't go into it too much in detail, but the way the Building Emissions Performance Standard works is there are intervals every 5 years where a cohort of buildings needs to achieve a set of targets. And so the very first target starts in 2027, where all those 4,000 buildings in the city will be put into one of those pathways. And we'll work with building owners to figure out which pathway is the right one. And then starting in 2031 to 2035, those initial steps around decarbonization will have to be taken. We built in a longer lead time for multifamily and for affordable housing and those buildings that house human services, recognizing that it's going to take more time to get the resources in place to make the investments to decarbonize. Okay, so what is happening now? We got this legislation passed in December. We are now going to go into a rulemaking where we get really detailed and talk through, some things like what are the reporting guidelines going to look like, and different ways of what kind of educational supports will building owners need. And we will have all of that done and wrapped up by the middle of next year, so that we can start working with building owners to actually comply with this. And so this is a little bit more about the design and support that we're going to have. We're going to be working with building owners to do analysis and case studies. We are looking for funding. We're in this moment where There is state funding, assuming an initiative doesn't pass. I don't know if I get to say that on university campus property, but there is an initiative that will undermine a lot of state funding that we are hoping stays in place so we can match make building owners to this funding. And then also all of the federal funding through the IRA and the Biden administration. And then, of course, we're doing a lot of work in terms of coaching and helping building owners take early action. And so here are some of the so we have something that we call our Clean Building Accelerator Program, where we're working with under-resourced buildings like Wing Luke or El Centro, the Pike Place Market. And that's where we're really helping provide engineering and technical support. And ultimately, we're hoping to match make with funding as well for some of those decarbonization programs. Okay, so that's a little bit about the emissions performance standard itself. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time and reflect on what I think it really takes to be able to do these hard things, especially in a moment where we are highly polarized. I like to think that in this particular regulation, we were able to get a lot of our business community and our climate justice community, which doesn't always sit down in the same room and talk to each other, to get to a place where they were willing to live with a really important regulation. And so what are some of the ingredients? So number one, I emphasize political leadership at the beginning of this. And some of you may know I'm a recovering politician. I was a state legislator from 2013 to 2017. And one of the things that I found being in politics is that there is no one who represents your values as well as you do. And so for any of you who are thinking about going into politics, it really matters that you are at the table, having people who care about climate, having people who care about environmental justice, and are in these positions where you get to make decisions really, really matters. So political leadership matters. The second thing that matters so much is expertise. And expertise looks like a lot of different things. We certainly have amazing policy experts on our staff, and they really helped craft a regulation that is nuanced and complicated. But community expertise really matters as well. One of the things we heard in our community outreach was an issue around cook stoves. Many small restaurant owners were really concerned around how this was going to impact their ability to to be able to have a business in a moment when, especially small restaurant owners have continued to struggle after the pandemic. And so that kind of expertise helped us basically push out some of our regulations on cook stoves, recognizing that there's going to be, hopefully a market transition. And we're also doing a pilot program to work with small business owners to help them get access to more expensive technology, which is what is more expensive now that we hope is going to come down. The third thing that I think is really important in lifting off a policy like this is creativity. And this isn't always something that you hear about in negotiation and policy making. I grew up in the Seattle area, and I got to take part in this community's amazing investment in jazz music in schools. And one of the things I learned as a jazz player is how to put something out there, how to listen and receive what comes back to you, and then how to put something else out there, again, that's informed by what we were all, doing together as musicians. And this is so important, especially when we're polarized, because my deep belief is that when we're really polarized, sometimes that means we need to invent something new. And to me, that's where creativity, and those of you, how many of you have studied music or participated in the arts or had an opportunity to do something creative? Great. I love that. Do more of it. Because those parts of our brains really are, I think, what help us invent something new. And that's sometimes what we need to do when we're really polarized. And then finally, the other ingredient is trust. And how do you build trust in a civic landscape like ours, where we fight really hard about really important issues, especially from government, where sometimes we have really done wrong by people, or where we are opaque and it's hard to get access to us. And I think that part of it is really showing up and going to where people are and doing what we say we're going to do, and doing that over and over and over and over and over again. And so that's a little piece of the trust part of this that I think is really important. And then actually I'm going to add two more, but to illustrate the two other kind of temperamental characteristics of doing something hard, I'm going to tell a short story, and then I'll conclude, and you guys can ask questions. So when I ran in 2013, or actually it was 2012 for the 2012 election, my grandmother, who was my very best friend, was 92 and she was dying. And she was so excited that I was running for office. And after, a hard day of campaigning, calling people for money, doorbelling, I would go visit her in her little apartment. And, she just would be so proud of me, and I'd tell her how the day went. And one day I was like, Nan, I need a campaign motto. What is my campaign motto? And, she was very, very close to her deathbed. She died just 3 weeks later after this conversation. But I could see her mind, still sharp but slow, like thinking. And she leaned into me and she said, Jess, we may not always be right, but we're never wrong. And in that moment, my grandmother basically trolled her granddaughter who was running for office, and, certainly about to be swayed by, power and all of the things that come with that. And what I love about my grandmother saying to that to me in that moment is, to do hard things, it also is about humility and recognizing that we are not always going to get it wrong, and that there are answers that are out there that are outside of ourselves. And then the other part of it is humor and having fun. And, again, my grandmother, right until the very end, was having fun. And so even though the news is so dire and that the task before us is so hard, I really hope that we all continue to come together and build trust with each other, be humble, and find ways to have fun. So with that, thank you so much. And it's really a privilege to be here today.
Thank you so much again for that incredible presentation. We now have some time to go into a Q&A. To get it all started, I would love to begin with one of our pre-prepared questions, which is whether this is in your role as Director of Sustainability and Environment or in any of your previous roles, what is the most meaningful project that you've ever worked on?
Oh, this is such a good question. So this one is really meaningful, in part because, bye everyone, thanks. My feelings aren't hurt, don't worry. I got it. I totally got it. So this project actually was really meaningful because it required everything that I've learned thus far to be able to guide my team and to work in a really tough political environment. And I would say more than anything right now, what I am practicing a lot is how to be de-escalated. Because I think being able to, put our shoulders down, take a deep breath, is really what allows us to be in a mindset that allows us to solve problems. And when you're in a negotiation, I think a lot of the time that's just a problem to solve. My values are telling me this, your values are telling you that. And again, going back to that creativity piece, how are we going to come up with that thing that allows us to get to both of our values? And you can only really do that, I think, when you're relaxed. And so I really feel like my role and what I've learned and what made this so meaningful was really getting to practice, helping all of us who were part of this really just, put our shoulders down and be able to be in a place where we could really talk to each other.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from the audience? I can come to you with the microphone. Over. Oh.
I had a question about natural gas. I know that that's been something that's really big with buildings decarbonizing, and I was wondering what the standards are around natural gas and how you're navigating the challenges of buildings that recently retrofitted to natural gas and now are being expected to be electrified.
Yep. So the basic deal with a building emissions performance standard in this part of the world is that buildings are going to have to move over to electricity from natural gas. So you basically have to get to zero fossil fuel use with some very narrow exceptions by 2050. So that's how we deal with natural gas. We're going to get to zero. However, your question is really good, which is sometimes building owners may have just made an investment, or a boiler may have just failed. There may be really good reasons why some kind of investment needed to get made right now. And that was one of the reasons why we felt like we needed to pass this legislation right away so that we could get in front of those replacement cycles that building owners have. And now that this legislation is passed, for any building owner, our hope is that they'll be able to build into their asset management plan this long lead time. And then the other thing is, where there are emergencies, especially for our under-resourced building owners, do we have the support funding so that if there is some kind of crisis, like a building goes out, we had this happen with a homeless shelter last winter. And how do we put together the funding to help them actually replace it with something that's electric instead of natural gas? So the long lead time is really important, and the technical support too.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you include community center solutions, because if we turn more to electricity and following like the dam removal campaigns, like how can such climate adaptations be also honoring and respectful of First Nations that are asking for the rivers to flow freely? Like, what are you thinking about? It is a hard topic, but how are you including the community in thinking about it?
That is a really great point. And so I'll just take a moment and talk a little bit about that. Of course, City Light uses hydropower. And one of the challenges with hydropower is that Washington State, Seattle have treaty obligations with our tribal partners to be able to provide salmon, and dams get in the way of that. And so as we are leaning on this grid and moving people to electrify, there's more and more pressure. And so how are we managing these tribal obligations that we have with the need to electrify? And so one of the things that is just true is that we are going to actually have to be looking at other clean energy resources like solar and wind. And wind and wave power is also challenging, because there are also treaty obligations that we have that can be impacted by that. But there are a lot of different ways that we can have a clean energy grid, and bringing the kind of the formal government to government dialogue is really important, so that we're not making decisions without having. So for example, permitting, and making sure that as we're looking at more solar power, we're bringing tribes into the conversation early and in a meaningful way, so that we're able to actually transform the grid. So that's a great question.
I think we had a question over here.
Yeah, hi. So what about the cement plant that you have south of downtown Seattle? That should be a huge emitter. Is that included in your 37% of all the emissions coming from buildings?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is, and it is an industry. So we are not, in this particular legislation, we're not regulating industry, and that's how it's categorized. But it does fall under the state's Climate Commitment Act, and does have to pay into the Climate Commitment Act fund, which, one, hopefully incentivizes lower emissions. I think it already is having that impact on some of our higher emitters in the city. And it creates resources, especially for those under-resourced buildings, to be able to have access to funding. So again, I can't talk, I think, about, this isn't a public university, but anyway, public policy matters, politics matters. Make sure you're engaged as we move towards the election in November. Other questions?
Thank you so much for telling us about how policies are made. My question is that Seattle is one amongst some of our sister cities that are going through these changes. So my question is, what do you think? What are the secret ingredients of the cities that some cities are more amenable to these changes, whereas others might have to have a longer route? Thank you.
Ooh, that's a good question. So, what makes some cities more amenable to these kinds of policies than others? I think one of the things that Seattle has is this long legacy of community leadership and engagement on environmental and social issues, social justice issues, right, across the board from so there is just this real legacy in this city of community activism that is definitely finding a conduit in the climate movement. And so I think that's something that's really important. I think another thing that's important for me personally, like why did I find myself in this work, being someone who grew up in this place, is just the natural beauty, right? Like we get to look to the east and the west and the south, and there are mountains. And if we're lucky, once in a while we get to see an orca, and and the trees that we have here. And so, I do think that just the proximity to the beauty of the world is here, and I think that matters. But we are also not perfect. I mean, there's so much that we can learn from other cities. One of the things that we're really excited about in my office is this idea called resilience hubs. And these are community spaces where, particularly in frontline communities, have kind of a trusted space to build resilience in advance of an emergency, but then in those moments of climate emergency have access to whatever it is that a community may need. And there are cities around the world that are really teaching us and leading us how to do that, particularly in the global south. And so we have the opportunity. One of the things that's so exciting about being in a city right now is that this is really where so much of the laboratory is happening around the climate crisis. And again, it's not just Seattle, there's so many other places around the world that we get to learn from. So that's my very narrow answer. I know every one of you maybe has an answer around why this city, why do we care about climate and environmental justice?
Thank you so much for your work and for being here in the presentation. It's amazing. I wondered if you would expand a little bit on the environmental justice aspects of this legislation, maybe in two parts. I'm curious, what were some of the primary concerns or priorities they had going into this in terms of localized emissions or costs? And how did you navigate that? And where did they kind of land in terms of those concerns and priorities in this? Thank you.
Yep, that's a great question. So one of the really interesting and exciting innovations that the Office of Sustainability and Environment has had the opportunity to get to be a part of is leading the charge in the city's Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal is a charge that was passed legislatively in 2019 to really build an equitable green economy to address the climate crisis, particularly as it impacts members of our community differently. Black, Indigenous, members of color, low-income members of our community are feeling the harms of the climate crisis in a different way. And so we came into this legislation having, in part, as partners, our Green New Deal Oversight Board, which is staffed in part by Sarah Cabillos, who is a Seattle University graduate. And that means that we have this forum to be in regular dialogue with frontline communities, representatives of tribes, labor representatives, scientists, climate justice activists. And so we regularly convened at really key points in our policymaking and help and solicited feedback. And so one of the things I talked about very briefly, our Clean Buildings Accelerator, which again is a fund that is aimed at lower under-resourced buildings, buildings serving BIPOC community organizations. that idea came out of the Green New Deal Oversight Board. So being able to, have that kind of regular ability to talk, and then also just talking to small businesses. Again, this issue around restaurants that came out through talking to small restaurant owners, and so I think for us, that policymaking orientation and really building in and taking seriously that listening to people who are, in their own lives and are experts in their own lives.
Thank you so much for all of the questions and the answers. That is unfortunately all the time we have for Q&A. So I'm going to hand the reins back over to Dr. Thompson for some closing remarks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.